Chapter 8 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, October 2007. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 8. A Vocation. Dinah, who had risen when the gentleman came in, but still kept hold of the sheet she was mending, curtsied respectfully when she saw Mr. Irwine looking at her and advancing towards her. He had never yet spoken to her, or stood face to face with her, and her first thought, as her eyes met his, was, "What a well-favoured countenance! Oh, that the good seed might fall on that soil, for it would surely flourish." The agreeable impression must have been mutual, for Mr. Irwine bowed to her with a benignant deference, which would have been equally in place if she had been the most dignified lady of his acquaintance. "You are only a visitor in this neighbourhood, I think?" were his first words as he seated himself opposite to her. "No, sir, I come from Snowfield, in Stonyshire, but my aunt was very kind, wanting me to have rest from my work there, because I'd been ill, and she invited me to come and stay with her for a while." "Ah, I remember Snowfield very well. I once had occasion to go there. It's a dreary, bleak place. They were building a cotton mill there, but that's many years ago now. I suppose the place is a good deal changed by the employment that mill must have brought." "It is changed, so far as the mill has brought people there who get a livelihood for themselves by working in it, and make it better for the tradesfolks. I work in it myself, and have reason to be grateful, for thereby I have enough and to spare. But it's still a bleak place, as you say, sir, very different from this country." "You have relations living there probably, so that you are attached to the place as your home?" "I had an aunt there once. She brought me up, for I was an orphan. But she was taken away 7 years ago, and I have no other kindred that I know of, besides my Aunt Poyser, who is very good to me, and would have me come and live in this country, which to be sure is a good land, wherein they eat bread without scarceness. But I'm not free to leave Snowfield, where I was first planted, and have grown deep into it, like the small grass on the hill-top." "Ah, I dare say you have many religious friends and companions there. You are a Methodist? A Wesleyan, I think?" "Yes, my aunt at Snowfield belonged to the society, and I have cause to be thankful for the privileges I have had thereby from my earliest childhood." "And have you been long in the habit of preaching? For I understand you preached at Hayslope last night." "I first took to the work 4 years ago, when I was 21. "Your society sanctions women's preaching, then?" "It doesn't forbid them, sir, when they've a clear call to the work, and when their ministry is owned by the conversion of sinners and the strengthening of God's people. Mrs. Fletcher, as you may have heard about, was the first woman to preach in the society, I believe, before she was married, when she was Miss Bosanquet. And Mr. Wesley approved of her undertaking the work. She had a great gift, and there are many others now living who are precious fellow-helpers in the work of the ministry. I understand there's been voices raised against it in the society of late, but I cannot but think their counsel will come to naught. It isn't for men to make channels for God's Spirit, as they make channels for the watercourses, flow here, but flow not there." "But don't you find some danger among your people? I don't mean to say that it is so with you, far from it, but don't you find sometimes that both men and women fancy themselves channels for God's Spirit, and are quite mistaken, so that they set about a work for which they are unfit, and bring holy things into contempt?" "Doubtless it is so sometimes, for there have been evildoers among us who have sought to deceive the brethren, and some there are who deceive their own selves. But we are not without discipline and correction to put a check upon these things. There's a very strict order kept among us, and the brethren and sisters watch for each other's souls, as they that must give account. They don't go every one his own way, and say, 'Am I my brother's keeper?' But tell me, if I may ask, and I am really interested in knowing it, how you first came to think of preaching." "Indeed, sir, I didn't think of it at all. I'd been used from the time I was 16 to talk to the little children and teach them, and sometimes I had had my heart enlarged to speak in class, and was much drawn out in prayer with the sick. But I had felt no call to preach, for when I'm not greatly wrought upon, I'm too much given to sit still and keep by myself. It seems as if I could sit silent all day long, with the thought of God overflowing my soul, as the pebbles lie bathed in the willow brook. For thoughts are so great, aren't they, sir? They seem to lie upon us like a deep flood, and it's my besetment to forget where I am, and everything about me, and lose myself in thoughts that I could give no account of, for I could neither make a beginning nor ending of them in words. That was my way as long as I can remember, but sometimes it seemed as if speech came to me without any will of my own, and words were given to me that came out as the tears come, because our hearts are full, and we can't help it. And those were always times of great blessing, though I had never thought it could be so with me before a congregation of people. But, sir, we are led on like little children, by a way that we know not. I was called to preach quite suddenly, and since then I have never been left in doubt about the work that was laid upon me. But tell me the circumstances, just how it was the very day you began to preach." "It was one Sunday I walked with Brother Marlowe, who was an aged man, one of the local preachers, all the way to Hetton Deeps, that's a village where the people get their living by working in the lead mines, and where there's no church nor preacher, but they live like sheep without a shepherd. It's better than 12 miles from Snowfield, so we set out early in the morning, for it was summer time, and I had a wonderful sense of the divine love as we walked over the hills, where there's no trees, you know, sir, as there is here, to make the sky look smaller, but you see the heavens stretched out like a tent, and you feel the everlasting arms around you. But before we got to Hetton, Brother Marlowe was seized with a dizziness that made him afraid of falling, for he overworked himself sadly, at his years, in watching and praying, and walking so many miles to speak the word, as well as carrying on his trade of linen weaving. And when we got to the village, the people were expecting him, for he'd appointed the time and the place when he was there before, and such of them as cared to hear the word of life were assembled on a spot where the cottages was thickest, so as others might be drawn to come. But he felt as he couldn't stand up to preach, and he was forced to lie down in the first of the cottages we came to. So I went to tell the people, thinking we'd go into one of the houses, and I would read and pray with them. But as I passed along by the cottages, and saw the aged and trembling women at the doors, and the hard looks of the men, who seemed to have their eyes no more filled with the sight of the Sabbath morning than if they had been dumb oxen that never looked up to the sky, I felt a great movement in my soul, and I trembled as if I was shaken by a strong spirit entering into my weak body. And I went to where the little flock of people was gathered together, and stepped on the low wall that was built against the green hillside, and I spoke the words that were given to me abundantly. And they all came round me out of all the cottages, and many wept over their sins, and have since been joined to the Lord. That was the beginning of my preaching, sir, and I've preached ever since." Dinah had let her work fall during this narrative, which she uttered in her usual simple way, but with that sincere, articulate, thrilling treble by which she always mastered her audience. She stooped now to gather up her sewing, and then went on with it as before. Mr. Irwine was deeply interested. He said to himself, "He must be a miserable prig who would act the pedagogue here. One might as well go and lecture the trees for growing in their own shape." "And you never feel any embarrassment from the sense of your youth, that you are a lovely young woman on whom men's eyes are fixed?" he said aloud. "No, I've no room for such feelings, and I don't believe the people ever take notice about that. I think, sir, when God makes his presence felt through us, we are like the burning bush. Moses never took any heed what sort of bush it was. He only saw the brightness of the Lord. I've preached to as rough, ignorant people as can be in the villages about Snowfield, men that looked very hard and wild, but they never said an uncivil word to me, and often thanked me kindly as they made way for me to pass through the midst of them." "That I can believe, that I can well believe," said Mr. Irwine, emphatically. "And what did you think of your hearers last night, now? Did you find them quiet and attentive?" "Very quiet, sir, but I saw no signs of any great work upon them. except in a young girl named Bessie Cranage, towards whom my heart yearned greatly, when my eyes first fell on her blooming youth, given up to folly and vanity. I had some private talk and prayer with her afterwards, and I trust her heart is touched. But I've noticed that in these villages, where the people lead a quiet life among the green pastures and the still waters, tilling the ground and tending the cattle, there's a strange deadness to the word, as different as can be from the great towns, like Leeds, where I once went to visit a holy woman who preaches there. It's wonderful how rich is the harvest of souls up those high-walled streets, where you seem to walk as in a prison yard, and the ear is deafened with the sounds of worldly toil. I think maybe it is because the promise is sweeter when this life is so dark and weary, and the soul gets more hungry when the body is ill at ease. Why, yes, our farm labourers are not easily roused. They take life almost as slowly as the sheep and cows. But we have some intelligent workmen about here. I dare say you know the Bedes. Seth Bede, by the by, is a Methodist." "Yes, I know Seth well, and his brother Adam a little. Seth is a gracious young man, sincere and without offence, and Adam is like the patriarch Joseph, for his great skill and knowledge and the kindness he shows to his brother and his parents. Perhaps you don't know the trouble that has just happened to them. Their father, Matthias Bede, was drowned in the Willow Brook last night, not far from his own door. I'm going now to see Adam." "Ah, their poor aged mother!" said Dinah, dropping her hands and looking before her with pitying eyes, as if she saw the object of her sympathy. "She will mourn heavily, for Seth has told me she is of an anxious, troubled heart. I must go and see if I can give her any help." As she rose and was beginning to fold up her work, Captain Donnithorne, having exhausted all plausible pretexts for remaining among the milk pans, came out of the dairy, followed by Mrs. Poyser. Mr. Irwine now rose also, and advancing towards Dinah, held out his hand and said, "Good-bye. I hear you are going away soon, but this will not be the last visit you will pay your aunt, so we shall meet again, I hope." His cordiality towards Dinah set all Mrs. Poyser's anxieties at rest, and her face was brighter than usual, as she said, "I've never asked after Mrs. Irwine and the Miss Irwines, sir. I hope they're as well as usual?" "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Poyser, except that Miss Anne has one of her bad headaches to-day. By the by, we all liked that nice cream cheese you sent us, my mother especially." "I'm very glad indeed, sir. It is but seldom I make one, but I remembered Mrs. Irwine was fond of 'em. Please to give my duty to her, and to Miss Kate and Miss Anne. They've never been to look at my poultry this long while, and I've got some beautiful speckled chickens, black and white, as Miss Kate might like to have some amongst hers." "Well, I'll tell her. She must come and see them. Good-bye," said the rector, mounting his horse. "Just ride slowly on, Irwine," said Captain Donnithorne, mounting also. "I'll overtake you in 3 minutes. I'm only going to speak to the shepherd about the whelps. Good-bye, Mrs. Poyser. Tell your husband I shall come and have a long talk with him soon." Mrs. Poyser curtsied duly, and watched the 2 horses until they had disappeared from the yard, amidst great excitement on the part of the pigs and the poultry, and under the furious indignation of the bulldog, who performed a Pyrrhic dance, that every moment seemed to threaten the breaking of his chain. Mrs. Poyser delighted in this noisy exit. It was a fresh assurance to her that the farmyard was well guarded, and that no loiterers could enter unobserved, and it was not until the gate had closed behind the captain that she turned into the kitchen again, where Dinah stood with her bonnet in her hand, waiting to speak to her aunt, before she set out for Lisbeth Bede's cottage. Mrs. Poyser, however, though she noticed the bonnet, deferred remarking on it until she had disburdened herself of her surprise at Mr. Irwine's behaviour. "Why, Mr. Irwine wasn't angry, then? What did he say to you, Dinah? Didn't he scold you for preaching?" "No, he was not at all angry. He was very friendly to me. I was quite drawn out to speak to him. I hardly know how, for I'd always thought of him as a worldly Sadducee. But his countenance is as pleasant as the morning sunshine." "Pleasant! And what else did you expect to find him but pleasant?" said Mrs. Poyser impatiently, resuming her knitting. "I should think his countenance is pleasant indeed, and him a gentleman born, and's got a mother like a picter. You may go the country round and not find such another woman turned 66. It's summat like to see such a man as that at the desk of a Sunday. As I say to Poyser, it's like looking at a crop full o' wheat, or a pasture with a fine dairy o' cows in it. It makes you think the world's comfortable like. But as for such creatures as you Methodists run after, I'd as soon go to look at a lot o' bare-ribbed runts on a common. Fine folks they are to tell you what's right, as look as if they'd never tasted nothing better than bacon sword and sour cake in their lives. But what did Mr. Irwine say to you about that fool's trick o' preaching on the green?" "He only said he'd heard of it. He didn't seem to feel any displeasure about it. But, dear aunt, don't think any more about that. He told me something that I'm sure will cause you sorrow as it does me. Thias Bede was drowned last night in the Willow Brook, and I'm thinking that the aged mother will be greatly in need of comfort. Perhaps I can be of use to her, so I have fetched my bonnet, and am going to set out." "Dear heart, dear heart! But you must have a cup of tea first, child," said Mrs. Poyser, falling at once from the key of B with 5 sharps to the frank and genial C. "The kettle's boiling. We'll have it ready in a minute, and the young uns'll be in and wanting theirs directly. I'm quite willing you should go and see the old woman, for you're one as is allays welcome in trouble, Methodist or no Methodist. But for the matter o' that, it's the flesh and blood folks are made on as makes the difference. Some cheeses are made o' skimmed milk, and some o' new milk, and it's no matter what you call 'em. You may tell which is which by the look and the smell. But as to Thias Bede, he's better out o' the way nor in. God forgive me for saying so, for he's done little this 10 year but make trouble for them as belonged to him, and I think it 'ud be well for you to take a little bottle o' rum for the old woman, for I dare say she's got never a drop o' nothing to comfort her inside. Sit down, child, and be easy, for you shan't stir out till you've had a cup o' tea, and so I tell you." During the latter part of this speech, Mrs. Poyser had been reaching down the tea things from the shelves, and was on her way towards the pantry for the loaf, followed close by Totty, who had made her appearance on the rattling of the teacups, when Hetty came out of the dairy relieving her tired arms by lifting them up and clasping her hands at the back of her head. "Molly," she said rather languidly, "just run out and get me a bunch of dock leaves. The butter's ready to pack up now." "Do you hear what's happened, Hetty?" said her aunt. "No, how should I hear anything?" was the answer, in a pettish tone. "Not as you'd care much, I dare say, if you did hear, for you're too feather-headed to mind if everybody was dead, so as you could stay upstairs a dressing yourself for 2 hours by the clock. But anybody besides yourself 'ud mind about such things happening to them as think a deal more of you than you deserve. But Adam Bede and all his kin might be drownded for what you'd care. You'd be perking at the glass the next minute." "Adam Bede drowned?" said Hetty, letting her arms fall and looking rather bewildered, but suspecting that her aunt was as usual exaggerating with a didactic purpose. "No, my dear, no," said Dinah kindly, for Mrs. Poyser had passed on to the pantry without deigning more precise information. "Not Adam. Adam's father, the old man, is drowned. He was drowned last night in the Willow Brook. Mr. Irwine has just told me about it." "Oh, how dreadful!" said Hetty, looking serious but not deeply affected, and as Molly now entered with the dock leaves, she took them silently and returned to the dairy without asking further questions. End of chapter 8.
Of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 9. Hetty's World. While she adjusted the broad leaves that set off the pale fragrant butter as the primrose is set off by its nest of green, I am afraid Hetty was thinking a great deal more of the looks Captain Donnithorne had cast at her than of Adam and his troubles. Bright, admiring glances from a handsome young gentleman with white hands, a gold chain, occasional regimentals, and wealth and grandeur immeasurable, those were the warm rays that set poor Hetty's heart vibrating and playing its little foolish tunes over and over again. We do not hear that Memnon statue gave forth its melody at all under the rushing of the mightiest wind, or in response to any other influence divine or human than certain short-lived sunbeams of morning, and we must learn to accommodate ourselves to the discovery that some of those cunningly fashioned instruments called human souls have only a very limited range of music, and will not vibrate in the least under a touch that fills others with tremulous rapture or quivering agony. Hetty was quite used to the thought that people liked to look at her. She was not blind to the fact that young Luke Britton of Broxton came to Hayslope Church on a Sunday afternoon on purpose that he might see her, and that he would have made much more decided advances if her uncle Poyser, thinking but lightly of a young man whose father's land was so foul as old Luke Britton's, had not forbidden her aunt to encourage him by any civilities. She was aware, too, that Mr. Craig, the gardener at the Chase, was over head and ears in love with her, and had lately made unmistakable avowals in luscious strawberries and hyperbolical peas. She knew still better that Adam Bede, tall, upright, clever, brave Adam Bede, who carried such authority with all the people round about, and whom her uncle was always delighted to see of an evening, saying that Adam knew a fine sight more of the nature of things than those as thought themselves his betters. She knew that this Adam, who was often rather stern to other people and not much given to run after the lasses, could be made to turn pale or red any day by a word or a look from her. Hetty's sphere of comparison was not large, but she couldn't help perceiving that Adam was something like a man, always knew what to say about things, could tell her uncle how to prop the hovel, and had mended the churn in no time, knew with only looking at it the value of the chestnut tree that was blown down, and why the damp came in the walls, and what they must do to stop the rats, and wrote a beautiful hand that you could read off, and could do figures in his head, a degree of accomplishment totally unknown among the richest farmers of that countryside. Not at all like that slouching Luke Britton, who, when she once walked with him all the way from Broxton to Hayslope, had only broken silence to remark that the grey goose had begun to lay. And as for Mr. Craig, the gardener, he was a sensible man enough, to be sure, but he was knock-kneed, and had a queer sort of sing-song in his talk. Moreover, on the most charitable supposition, he must be far on the way to 40. Hetty was quite certain her uncle wanted her to encourage Adam, and would be pleased for her to marry him, for those were times when there was no rigid demarcation of rank between the farmer and the respectable artisan, and on the home hearth, as well as in the public house, they might be seen taking their jug of ale together, the farmer having a latent sense of capital and of weight in parish affairs, which sustained him under his conspicuous inferiority in conversation. Martin Poyser was not a frequenter of public houses, but he liked a friendly chat over his own home-brewed, and though it was pleasant to lay down the law to a stupid neighbour who had no notion how to make the best of his farm, it was also an agreeable variety to learn something from a clever fellow like Adam Bede. Accordingly, for the last 3 years, ever since he had superintended the building of the new barn, Adam had always been made welcome at the Hall Farm, especially of a winter evening, when the whole family, in patriarchal fashion, master and mistress, children and servants, were assembled in that glorious kitchen, at well-graduated distances from the blazing fire. And for the last 2 years, at least, Hetty had been in the habit of hearing her uncle say, "Adam Bede may be working for wage now, but he'll be a master-man some day, as sure as I sit in this chair. Mr. Burge is in the right on't to want him to go partners and marry his daughter, if it's true what they say. The woman as marries him will have a good take, be it Lady Day or Michaelmas," a remark which Mrs. Poyser always followed up with her cordial assent. "Ah," she would say, "it's all very fine having a ready-made rich man, but mayhappen he'll be a ready-made fool, and it's no use filling your pocket full of money if you've got a hole in the corner. It'll do you no good to sit in a spring cart of your own. If you've got a soft to drive you, he'll soon turn you over into the ditch. I always said I'd never marry a man as'd got no brains, for where's the use of a woman having brains of her own if she's tackled to a geck as everybody's a-laughing at? She might as well dress herself fine to sit backwards on a donkey." These expressions, though figurative, sufficiently indicated the bent of Mrs. Poyser's mind with regard to Adam, and though she and her husband might have viewed the subject differently if Hetty had been a daughter of their own, it was clear that they would have welcomed the match with Adam for a penniless niece. For what could Hetty have been but a servant elsewhere, if her uncle had not taken her in and brought her up as a domestic help to her aunt, whose health since the birth of Totty had not been equal to more positive labour than the superintendence of servants and children? But Hetty had never given Adam any steady encouragement. Even in the moments when she was most thoroughly conscious of his superiority to her other admirers, she had never brought herself to think of accepting him. She liked to feel that this strong, skilful, keen-eyed man was in her power, and would have been indignant if he had shown the least sign of slipping from under the yoke of her coquettish tyranny and attaching himself to the gentle Mary Burge, who would have been grateful enough for the most trifling notice of him. Mary Burge, indeed! Such a sallow-faced girl. If she put on a bit of pink ribbon, she looked as yellow as a crow-flower, and her hair was as straight as a hank of cotton. And always when Adam stayed away for several weeks from the Hall Farm, and otherwise made some show of resistance to his passion as a foolish one, Hetty took care to entice him back into the net by little airs of meekness and timidity, as if she were in trouble at his neglect. But as to marrying Adam, that was a very different affair. There was nothing in the world to tempt her to do that. Her cheeks never grew a shade deeper when his name was mentioned. She felt no thrill when she saw him passing along the causeway by the window, or advancing towards her unexpectedly in the footpath across the meadow. She felt nothing when his eyes rested on her but the cold triumph of knowing that he loved her and would not care to look at Mary Burge. He could no more stir in her the emotions that make the sweet intoxication of young love than the mere picture of a sun can stir the spring sap in the subtle fibres of the plant. She saw him as he was, a poor man with old parents to keep who would not be able, for a long while to come, to give her even such luxuries as she shared in her uncle's house. And Hetty's dreams were all of luxuries: to sit in a carpeted parlour and always wear white stockings, to have some large beautiful earrings, such as were all the fashion, to have Nottingham lace round the top of her gown, and something to make her handkerchief smell nice, like Miss Lydia Donnithorne's when she drew it out at church, and not to be obliged to get up early or be scolded by anybody. She thought if Adam had been rich and could have given her these things, she loved him well enough to marry him. But for the last few weeks a new influence had come over Hetty, vague, atmospheric, shaping itself into no self-confessed hopes or prospects, but producing a pleasant narcotic effect, making her tread the ground and go about her work in a sort of dream, unconscious of weight or effort, and showing her all things through a soft, liquid veil, as if she were living not in this solid world of brick and stone, but in a beatified world, such as the sun lights up for us in the waters. Hetty had become aware that Mr. Arthur Donnithorne would take a good deal of trouble for the chance of seeing her, that he always placed himself at church so as to have the fullest view of her both sitting and standing, that he was constantly finding reason for calling at the Hall Farm, and always would contrive to say something for the sake of making her speak to him and look at him. The poor child no more conceived at present the idea that the young squire could ever be her lover than a baker's pretty daughter in the crowd, whom a young emperor distinguishes by an imperial but admiring smile, conceives that she shall be made empress. But the baker's daughter goes home and dreams of the handsome young emperor, and perhaps weighs the flour amiss while she is thinking what a heavenly lot it must be to have him for a husband. And so poor Hetty had got a face and a presence haunting her waking and sleeping dreams. Bright, soft glances had penetrated her, and suffused her life with a strange, happy languor. The eyes that shed those glances were really not half so fine as Adam's, which sometimes looked at her with a sad, beseeching tenderness, but they had found a ready medium in Hetty's little silly imagination, whereas Adam's could get no entrance through that atmosphere. For 3 weeks at least her inward life had consisted of little else than living through in memory the looks and words Arthur had directed towards her, of little else than recalling the sensations with which she heard his voice outside the house, and saw him enter, and became conscious that his eyes were fixed on her, and then became conscious that a tall figure, looking down on her with eyes that seemed to touch her, was coming nearer in clothes of beautiful texture, with an odour like that of a flower garden borne on the evening breeze. Foolish thoughts! But all this happened, you must remember, nearly 60 years ago, and Hetty was quite uneducated, a simple farmer's girl, to whom a gentleman with a white hand was dazzling as an Olympian god. Until today she had never looked farther into the future than to the next time Captain Donnithorne would come to the farm, or the next Sunday when she should see him at church. But now she thought perhaps he would try to meet her when she went to the chase tomorrow, and if he should speak to her and walk a little way when nobody was by. That had never happened yet, and now her imagination, instead of retracing the past, was busy fashioning what would happen tomorrow, whereabout in the chase she should see him coming towards her, how she should put her new rose-coloured ribbon on, which she had never seen, and what he would say to her to make her return his glance, a glance which she would be living through in her memory over and over again all the rest of the day. In this state of mind, how could Hetty give any feeling to Adam's troubles, or think much about poor old Thias being drowned? Young souls in such pleasant delirium as hers are as unsympathetic as butterflies sipping nectar. They are isolated from all appears by a barrier of dreams, by invisible looks and impalpable arms. While Hetty's hands were busy packing up the butter, and her head filled with these pictures of the morrow, Arthur Donnithorne, riding by Mr. Irwin's side towards the valley of the Willow Brook, had also certain indistinct anticipations, running as an undercurrent in his mind while he was listening to Mr. Irwin's account of Dinah, indistinct yet strong enough to make him feel rather conscious when Mr. Irwin suddenly said, "What fascinated you so in Mrs. Poyser's dairy, Arthur? Have you become an amateur of damp quarries and skimming dishes?" Arthur knew the rector too well to suppose that a clever invention would be of any use, so he said with his accustomed frankness, "No, I went to look at the pretty butter-maker, Hetty Sorrel. She's a perfect Hebe, and if I were an artist, I would paint her. It's amazing what pretty girls one sees among the farmers' daughters, when the men are such clowns. That common, round, red face one sees sometimes in the men, all cheek and no features, like Martin Poyser's, comes out in the women of the family as the most charming phiz imaginable. Well, I have no objection to your contemplating Hetty in an artistic light, but I must not have you feeding her vanity and filling her little noodle with the notion that she's a great beauty, attractive to fine gentlemen, or you will spoil her for a poor man's wife, honest Craigs, for example, whom I have seen bestowing soft glances on her. The little puss seems already to have airs enough to make a husband as miserable as it's a law of nature for a quiet man to be when he marries a beauty. Apropos of marrying, I hope our friend Adam will get settled, now the poor old man's gone. He will only have his mother to keep him in future, and I've a notion that there's a kindness between him and that nice modest girl, Mary Burge, from something that fell from old Jonathan one day when I was talking to him. But when I mentioned the subject to Adam, he looked uneasy and turned the conversation. I suppose the love-making doesn't run smooth, or perhaps Adam hangs back till he's in a better position. He has independence of spirit enough for two men, rather an excess of pride, if anything. That would be a capital match for Adam. He would slip into old Burge's shoes and make a fine thing of that building business. I'll answer for him. I should like to see him well settled in this parish. He would be ready then to act as my grand vizier when I wanted one. We could plan no end of repairs and improvements together. I've never seen the girl, though, I think. At least I've never looked at her. Look at her next Sunday at church. She sits with her father on the left of the reading desk. You needn't look quite so much at Hetty Sorrel, then. When I've made up my mind that I can't afford to buy a tempting dog, I take no notice of him, because if he took a strong fancy to me and looked lovingly at me, the struggle between arithmetic and inclination might become unpleasantly severe. I pique myself on my wisdom there, Arthur, and as an old fellow to whom wisdom has become cheap, I bestow it upon you. Thank you. It may stand me in good stead some day, though I don't know that I have any present use for it. Bless me, how the brook has overflowed. Suppose we have a canter now we're at the bottom of the hill. That is the great advantage of dialogue on horseback. It can be merged any minute into a trot or a canter, and one might have escaped from Socrates himself in the saddle. The two friends were free from the necessity of further conversation till they pulled up in the lane behind Adam's cottage. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 10. Dinah visits Lisbeth. At 5 o'clock Lisbeth came downstairs with a large key in her hand. It was the key of the chamber where her husband lay dead. Throughout the day, except in her occasional outbursts of wailing grief, she had been in incessant movement, performing the initial duties to her dead with the awe and exactitude that belong to religious rites. She had brought out her little store of bleached linen, which she had for long years kept in reserve for this supreme use. It seemed but yesterday, that time so many midsummers ago, when she had told Thais where this linen lay. that he might be sure and reach it out for her when she died, for she was the elder of the two. Then there had been the work of cleansing to the strictest purity every object in the sacred chamber, and of removing from it every trace of common daily occupation. The small window which had hitherto freely let in the frosty moonlight or the warm summer sunrise on the working man's slumber, must not be darkened with a fair white sheet, for this was the sleep which is as sacred under the bare rafters as in sealed houses. Lisbeth had even mended a long neglected and unnoticeable rent in checkered bit of bed curtain, for the moments were few and precious now in which she would be able to do the smallest office of respect or love for the still corpse, to which in all her thoughts she attributed some consciousness. Our dead are never dead to us until we have forgotten them. They can be injured by us, they can be wounded, they know all our penitence, all our aching sense that their place is empty, all the kisses we bestow on the smallest relic of their presence. And the aged peasant woman most of all believes that her dead are conscious. Decent burial was what Lisbeth had been thinking of for herself through years of thrift, with an indistinct expectation that she should know when she was being carried to the churchyard, followed by her husband and her sons. And now she felt as if the greatest work of her life were to be done in seeing that Thais was buried decently before her under the white thorn, where once, in a dream, she had thought she lay in the coffin, yet all the while saw the sunshine above, and smelt the white blossoms that were so thick upon the thorn the Sunday she went to be churched after Adam was born. But now she had done everything that could be done today in the chamber of death, had done it all herself, with some aid from her sons in lifting, for she would let no one be fetched to help her from the village, not being fond of female neighbours generally, and her favourite Dolly, the old housekeeper at Mr. Burge's, who had come to condole with her in the morning as soon as she heard of Thias's death, was too dim-sighted to be of much use. She had locked the door, and now held the key in her hand, as she threw herself wearily into a chair that stood out of its place in the middle of the house floor, where in ordinary times she would never have consented to sit. The kitchen had had none of her attention that day. It was soiled with the tread of muddy shoes, and untidy with clothes and other objects out of place. But what at another time would have been intolerable to Lisbeth's habits of order and cleanliness seemed to her now just what should be. It was right that things should look strange and disordered and wretched, now that the old man had come to his end in that sad way. The kitchen ought not to look as if nothing had happened. Adam, overcome with the agitations and exertions of the day after his night of hard work, had fallen asleep on a bench in the workshop, and Seth was in the back kitchen making a fire of sticks that he might get the kettle to boil, and persuade his mother to have a cup of tea, an indulgence which she rarely allowed herself. There was no one in the kitchen when Lisbeth entered and threw herself into the chair. She looked round with blank eyes at the dirt and confusion on which the bright afternoon sun shone dismally. It was all of a piece with the sad confusion of her mind, that confusion which belongs to the first hours of a sudden sorrow, when the poor human soul is like one who has been deposited sleeping among the ruins of a vast city, and wakes up in dreary amazement, not knowing whether it is the growing of the dying day, not knowing why and whence came this illimitable scene of desolation, or why he too finds himself desolate in the midst of it. At another time Lisbeth's first thought would have been, "Where is Adam?" But the sudden death of her husband had restored him in these hours to that first place in her affections which he had held 26 years ago. She had forgotten his faults as we forget the sorrows of our departed childhood, and thought of nothing but the young husband's kindness and the old man's patience. Her eyes continued to wander blankly until Seth came in and began to remove some of the scattered things, and clear the small round deal table that he might set out his mother's tea upon it. "What art going to do?" she said, rather peevishly. "I want thee to have a cup of tea, mother," answered Seth tenderly. "It'll do thee good, and I'll put 2 or 3 of these things away, and make the house look more comfortable." "Comfortable? How canst talk o' mane things comfortable? Let it be, let it be. There's no comfort for me no more," she went on, the tears coming when she began to speak. "Now thy poor father's gone, as I'n washed for and mended, and got's victual for him for 30 year, and him always so pleased with everything I done for him, and used to be so handy and do the jobs for me when I were ill and cumbered with the bubby, and made me the posset and brought it upstairs as proud as could be, and carried the lad as wore as heavy as 2 children for 5 miles, and near grumbled, all the way to Warson Wake, 'cause I wanted to go and see my sister, as war dead and gone the very next Christmas, and come, and him to be drowned in the brook as we passed all the day we were married, and come home together. And he'd made me lots o' shelves for me to put my plates and things on, and showed 'em me as proud as could be, 'cause he knowed I should be pleased. And he were to die, and me not to know, but to be and sleepin' in my bed, as if I caredna nought about it. Eh, and me to live to see that, and us, as war young folks once, and thought we should do rarely when we were married. Let it be, lad, let it be. I wonna ha no tay. I carena if I ne'er ate nor drink no more. When one end o' the bridge tumbles down, where the use o' the other stannin'? I may's well die and follow my old man. There's no knowing but he'll want me." Here Lisbeth broke from words into moans, swaying herself backwards and forwards on her chair. Seth, always timid in his behaviour towards his mother, from the sense that he had no influence over her, felt it was useless to attempt to persuade or soothe her till this passion was past, so he contented himself with tending the back kitchen fire and folding up his father's clothes, which had been hanging out to dry since morning, afraid to move about in the room where his mother was, lest he should irritate her further. But after Lisbeth had been rocking herself and moaning for some minutes, she suddenly paused and said aloud to herself, "I'll go and see arter Adam, for I canna think where he's gotten, and I want him to go upstairs with me afore it's dark, for the minutes to look at the corpse is like the melting snow." Seth overheard this, and coming into the kitchen again, as his mother rose from her chair, he said, "Adam's asleep in the workshop, mother. Thee'd better not wake him. He was overwrought with work and trouble." "Wake him? Who's a going to wake him? I shanna wake wi' looking at him. I hadn't seen the lad this 2 hour. I'd welly forgotten as he'd growed up from a baby, when's father carried him." Adam was seated on a rough bench, his head supported by his arm, which rested from the shoulder to the elbow on the long planing table in the middle of the workshop. It seemed as if he had sat down for a few minutes' rest and had fallen asleep without slipping from his first attitude of sad, fatigued thought. His face, unwashed since yesterday, looked pallid and clammy. His hair was tossed shaggily about his forehead, and his closed eyes had the sunken look which follows upon watching and sorrow. His brow was knit, and his whole face had an expression of weariness and pain. Gyp was evidently uneasy, for he sat on his haunches, resting his nose on his master's stretched out leg, and dividing the time between licking the hand that hung listlessly down, and glancing with a listening air towards the door. The poor dog was hungry and restless, but would not leave his master, and was waiting impatiently for some change in the scene. It was owing to this feeling on Gyp's part that, when Lisbeth came into the workshop and advanced towards Adam as noiselessly as she could, her intention to awaken him was immediately defeated, for Gyp's excitement was too great to find vent in anything short of a sharp bark, and in a moment Adam opened his eyes and saw his mother standing before him. It was not very unlike his dream, for his sleep had been little more than living through again, in a fevered delirious way, all that had happened since daybreak, and his mother with her fretful grief was present to him through it all. The chief difference between the reality and the vision was that in his dream Hetty was continually coming before him in bodily presence, strangely mingling herself as an actor in scenes with which she had nothing to do. She was even by the willow brook. She made his mother angry by coming into the house, and he met her with her smart clothes quite wet through, as he walked in the rain to Treddleston to tell the coroner. But wherever Hetty came, his mother was sure to follow soon, and when he opened his eyes, it was not at all startling to see her standing near him. "Eh, my lad, my lad!" Lisbeth burst out immediately, her wailing impulse returning, for grief in its freshness feels the need of associating its loss and its lament with every change of scene and incident. "Thee's got nobody now but thy old mother to torment thee and be a burden to thee. Thy poor father, 'ull ne'er anger thee no more, and thy mother may's well go arter him. The sooner the better, for I'm no good to nobody now. One cold coat and you'll do to patch another, but it's good for nought else. Thee's like to have a wife to mend thy clothes and get thy victual, better nor thy old mother. And I shall be nought but cumber, a-sitting i' the chimney corner." Adam winced and moved uneasily. He dreaded of all things to hear his mother speak of Hetty. "But if thy father had lived, he'd ne'er ha' wanted me to go to make room for another, for he could no more ha' done without me, nor one side o' the scissors can do without the other. Ah, we should ha' been both flung away together, and then I shouldn't ha' seen this day, and one burying, 'ud ha' done for us both." Here Lisbeth paused, but Adam sat in pained silence. He could not speak otherwise than tenderly to his mother to-day, but he could not help being irritated by this plaint. It was not possible for poor Lisbeth to know how it affected Adam any more than it is possible for a wounded dog to know how his moans affect the nerves of his master. Like all complaining women, she complained in the expectation of being soothed, and when Adam said nothing, she was only prompted to complain more bitterly. "I know thees couldn't do better wi'out me, for thee couldst go where thee likeliest and marry them as thee likest. But I dunna want to say thee nay. Let thee bring home who thee wot. I ne'er open my lips to find fault, for when folks is old and of no use, they may think theirseens well off to get the bit and the sup, though they ne'er swallow ill words wit. And if thee set thy heart on a lass as bring thee nought and waste all, when thee mightst have them, as 'ud make a man o' thee, I'll say nought, now thy father's dead and drownded, for I'm no better nor an old haft when the blade's gone." Adam, unable to bear this any longer, rose silently from the bench and walked out of the workshop into the kitchen, but Lisbeth followed him. "Thee want to go upstairs and see thy father, then? I'n done everything now, and he'd like thee to go and look at him, for he were allays so pleased when thee was mild to him." Adam turned round at once and said, "Yes, mother, let us go upstairs. Come, Seth, let us go together." They went upstairs, and for 5 minutes all was silence. Then the key was turned again, and there was a sound of footsteps on the stairs. But Adam did not come down again. He was too weary and worn out to encounter more of his mother's querulous grief, and he went to rest on his bed. Lisbeth no sooner entered the kitchen and sat down than she threw her apron over her head and began to cry and moan and rock herself as before. Seth thought, "She will be quieter by and by, now we have been upstairs," and he went into the back kitchen again to tend his little fire, hoping that he should presently induce her to have some tea. Lisbeth had been rocking herself in this way for more than 5 minutes, giving a low moan with every forward movement of her body, when she suddenly felt a hand placed gently on hers, and a sweet treble voice said to her, "Dear sister, the Lord has sent me to see if I can be a comfort to you." Lisbeth paused, in a listening attitude, without removing her apron from her face. The voice was strange to her. Could it be her sister's spirit come back to her from the dead after all those years? She trembled and dared not look. Dinah, believing that this pause of wonder was in itself a relief for the sorrowing woman, said no more just yet, but quietly took off her bonnet, and then, motioning silence to Seth, who, on hearing her voice, had come in with a beating heart, laid one hand on the back of Lisbeth's chair and leaned over her, that she might be aware of a friendly presence. Slowly Lisbeth drew down her apron, and timidly she opened her dim dark eyes. She saw nothing at first but a face, a pure, pale face, with loving grey eyes, and it was quite unknown to her. Her wonder increased. Perhaps it was an angel. But in the same instant Dinah had laid her hand on Lisbeth's again, and the old woman looked down at it. It was a much smaller hand than her own, but it was not white and delicate, for Dinah had never worn a glove in her life, and her hand bore the traces of labour from her childhood upwards. Lisbeth looked earnestly at the hand for a moment, and then, fixing her eyes again on Dinah's face, said, with something of restored courage, but in a tone of surprise. "Why, you're a working woman." "Yes, I am Dinah Morris, and I work in the cotton mill when I am at home." "Aye," said Lisbeth slowly, still wondering. "Ye come in so light, like the shadow on the wall, and spoke in my ear as I thought ye might be a spirit. Ye've got a'most the face of one as is a sitting on the grave. I Adam's new Bible. I come from the Hall Farm now. You know Mrs. Poyser, she's my aunt, and she has heard of your great affliction, and is very sorry, and I'm come to see if I can be any help to you in your trouble, for I know your sons Adam and Seth, and I know you have no daughter, and when the clergyman told me how the hand of God was heavy upon you, my heart went out towards you, and I felt a command to come and be to you in the place of a daughter in this grief, if you will let me." "Ah, I know who you are now. You are a Methodist, like Seth. He's told me on you," said Lisbeth fretfully, her overpowering sense of pain returning. Now her wonder was gone. "You'll make it out as trouble's a good thing, like he always does. But where's the use o' talking to me at that'n? Ye can't make the smart less wi' talking. You'll ne'er make me believe as it's better for me not to have my old man die in's bed, if he must die, and have the parson to pray by him, and me to sit by him, and tell him ne'er to mind the ill words I've given him sometimes when I were angered, and to give him a bit and a sup, as long as a bit and a sup he'd swallow. But to die in the cold water, and you's close to him, and near to know, and me a sleeping as if I ne'er belonged to him no more, nor if he'd been a journeyman tramp from nobody knows where." Here Lisbeth began to cry and rock herself again, and Dinah said, "Yes, dear friend, your affliction is great. It would be hardness of heart to say that your trouble was not heavy to bear. God didn't send me to you to make light of your sorrow, but to mourn with you, if you will let me. If you had a table spread for a feast, and was making merry with your friends, you would think it was kind to let me come and sit down and rejoice with you, because you'd think I should like to share those good things. But I should like better to share in your trouble and your labour, and it would seem harder to me if you denied me that. You won't send me away? You're not angry with me for coming?" "Nay, nay, angered? Who said I were angered? It were good on you to come. And Seth, why donna ye get her some tay? Ye were in a hurry to get some for me, as had no need, but you donna think o' getting to for them as wants it. Sit ye down, sit ye down. I thank you kindly for comin', for it's a little wage ye get by walking through the wet fields to see an old woman like me. Nah, I've got no daughter. My own ne'er had one. I warna sorry, for they're poor queechy things, gells is. I always wanted to have lads as could fend for theirsens. An' the lads 'ull be marrying, I shall have daughters enough, and too many. But now, do you make the tay as you like it, for I've got no taste in my mouth this day. It's all one what I swallow. It's all got the taste of sorrow wi't." Dinah took care not to betray that she had had her tea, and accepted Lisbeth's invitation very readily, for the sake of persuading the old woman herself to take the food and drink she so much needed after a day of hard work and fasting. Seth was so happy now Dinah was in the house that he could not help thinking her presence was worth purchasing with a life in which grief incessantly followed upon grief. But the next moment he reproached himself. It was almost as if he was rejoicing in his father's sad death. Nevertheless, the joy of being with Dinah would triumph. It was like the influence of climate, which no resistance can overcome, and the feeling even suffused itself over his face so as to attract his mother's notice while she was drinking her tea. "Thee may's well talk o' trouble being a good thing, Seth, for thee thrivest on't. Thee look'st as if thee know'st no more o' care and cumber nor when thee was a babby a lying awake in the cradle, for thee'st allays lie still wi' thy eyes open, and Adam ne'er 'ull lie still a minute when he wakened. Thee wast allays like a bag o' meal as can ne'er be bruised though, for the matter o' that, thy poor father war just such another. But ye've got the same look too." Here Lisbeth turned to Dinah. "I reckon it's wi' bein' a Methody. Not as I'm a finding fault wi' the fort, for we've no call to be frettin'. And somehow ye looken sorry too. Well, if the Methodies are fond o' trouble, they're like to thrive. It's a pity they canna ha't all, and take it away from thee as dunna like it. I could ha' given him plenty, for when I'd gotten my old man I war warranted from morn till night, and now he's gone, I'd be glad for the worst o'er again." "Yes," said Dinah, careful not to oppose any feeling of Lisbeth's, for her reliance, in her smallest words and deeds, on a divine guidance, always issued in that finest woman's tact, which proceeds from acute and ready sympathy. "Yes, I remember too, when my dear aunt died, I longed for the sound of her bad cough in the nights, instead of the silence that came when she was gone. But now, dear friend, drink this other cup of tea and eat a little more." "What?" said Lisbeth, taking the cup and speaking in a less querulous tone. "Had ye got no father and mother, then, as ye were so sorry about your aunt?" "No, I never knew a father or a mother. My aunt brought me up from a baby. She had no children, for she was never married, and she brought me up as tenderly as if I'd been her own child." "She'd fine work wi' ye, I'll warrant, bringing ye up from a babby, and her a lone woman. It's ill bringing up a cad lamb. But I daresay ye warna frenzy, for ye look as if ye need been angered i' your life. But what did ye say when your aunt died? And why donna ye come to live in this country, being as Mrs. Poyser's your aunt too?" Dinah, seeing that Lisbeth's attention was attracted, told the story of her early life, how she had been brought up to work hard, and what sort of place Snowfield was, and how many people had a hard life there, all the details that she thought likely to interest Lisbeth. The old woman listened, and forgot to be fretful, unconsciously subject to the soothing influence of Dinah's face and voice. After a while she was persuaded to let the kitchen to be made tidy, for Dinah was bent on this, believing that the sense of order and quietude around her would help in disposing Lisbeth to join in the prayer she longed to pour forth at her side. Seth meanwhile went out to chop wood, for he surmised that Dinah would like to be left alone with his mother. Lisbeth sat watching her as she moved about in her still quick way, and said at last, "You've got a notion o' cleaning up. I wouldn't mind ye for a daughter, for ye wouldn't spend the lad's wage in fine clothes and waste. Ye're not like the lasses on this countryside. I reckon folks is different at Snowfield from what they are here." "They have a different sort of life, many of 'em," said Dinah. "They work at different things, some in the mill, and many in the mines. in the villages round about. But the heart of man is the same everywhere, and there are the children of this world and the children of light there as well as elsewhere. But we've many more Methodists there than in this country. Well, I didn't know as a Methody woman were like ye, for there's Will Maskery's wife, as they say a big Methody, isn't pleasant to look at all. I'd as lief look at a toad. And I'm thinking, and I wouldn't mind if ye'd stayed and sleep here, for I should like to see ye thy house in the morning. But mayhappen they'll be looking for ye at Mester Poyser's." "No," said Dinah, "they don't expect me, and I should like to stay if you'll let me." "Well, there's room. I've got me bed laid in thy little room o' the back kitchen, and ye can lie beside me. I'd be glad to have you with me to speak in the night, for you've got a nice way o' talking. It puts me in mind of the swallows was under the thack last year, when they first began to sing low and soft like in the morning. Ah, but my old man were fond o' them birds, and so were Adam. But they're near comed again this year. Happen they're dead too." "There," said Dinah, "now the kitchen looks tidy. And now, dear mother, for I'm your daughter to-night, you know, I should like you to wash your face and have a clean cap on. Do you remember what David did, when God took away his child from him? While the child was yet alive, he fasted and prayed to God to spare it, and he would neither eat nor drink, but lay on the ground all night, beseeching God for the child. But when he knew it was dead, he rose up from the ground and washed and anointed himself, and changed his clothes, and ate and drank. And when they asked him how it was that he seemed to have left off grieving now the child was dead, he said, 'While the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, Who can tell whether God will be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now he is dead, wherefore should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me.'" "Ah, that's a true word," said Lisbeth. "Yea, my old man wonna come back to me, but I shall go to him, the sooner the better. Well, ye may do as ye like with me. There's a clean cap in the drawer, and I'll go in the back o' the kitchen and wash my face. And Seth, thee mayst reach down Adam's new Bible with the pictures in, and she shall read us a chapter. Ah, I like them words. I shall go to him, but he wonna come back to me." Dinah and Seth were both inwardly offering thanks for the greatest quietness of spirit that had come over Lisbeth. This was what Dinah had been trying to bring about, through all her still sympathy and absence from exhortation. From her girlhood upwards she had had experience among the sick and the mourning, among minds hardened and shrivelled through poverty and ignorance, and had gained the subtlest perception of the mode in which they could best be touched and softened into willingness to receive words of spiritual consolation or warning. As Dinah expressed it, she was never left to herself, but it was always given her when to keep silence and when to speak. And do we not all agree to call rapid thought and noble impulse by the name of inspiration? After our subtlest analysis of the mental process, we must still say, as Dinah did, that our highest thoughts and our best deeds are all given to us. And so there was earnest prayer, there was faith, love, and hope pouring forth that evening in the little kitchen. And poor, aged, fretful Lisbeth, without grasping any distinct idea, without going through any course of religious emotions, felt a vague sense of goodness and love, and of something right lying underneath and beyond all this sorrowing life. She couldn't understand the sorrow, but, for these moments, under the subduing influence of Dinah's spirit, she felt that she must be patient and still. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 11. In the Cottage. It was but 4:30 the next morning when Dinah, tired of lying awake listening to the birds and watching the growing light through the little window in the garret roof, rose and began to dress herself very quietly, lest she should disturb Lisbeth. But already someone else was astir in the house, and had gone downstairs, preceded by Gyp. The dog's pattering step was a sure sign that it was Adam who went down. But Dinah was not aware of this, and she thought it was more likely to be Seth, for he had told her how Adam had stayed up working the night before. Seth, however, had only just awakened at the sound of the opening door. The exciting influence of the previous day, heightened at last by Dinah's unexpected presence, had not been counteracted by any bodily weariness, for he had not done his ordinary amount of hard work, and so when he went to bed it was not till he had tired himself with hours of tossing wakefulness that drowsiness came, and led on a heavier morning sleep than was usual with him. But Adam had been refreshed by his long rest, and with his habitual impatience of mere passivity, he was eager to begin the new day and subdue sadness by his strong will and strong arm. The white mist lay in the valley. It was going to be a bright warm day, and he would start to work again when he had had his breakfast. "There's nothing but what's bearable as long as a man can work," he said to himself. "The nature o' things doesn't change, though it seems as if one's own life was nothing but change. The square of 4 is 16, and you must lengthen your lever in proportion to your weight. It is true when a man's miserable as when he's happy, and the best o' working is, it gives you a grip hold of things outside your own lot." As he dashed the cold water over his head and face, he felt completely himself again, and with his black eyes as keen as ever and his thick black hair all glistening with the fresh moisture, he went into the workshop to look out the wood for his father's coffin, intending that he and Seth should carry it with them to Jonathan Burge's, and have the coffin made by one of the workmen there, so that his mother might not see and hear the sad task going forward at home. He had just gone into the workshop when his quick ear detected a light rapid foot on the stairs, certainly not his mother's. He had been in bed and asleep when Dinah had come in the evening, and now he wondered whose step this could be. A foolish thought came and moved him strangely, as if it could be Hetty. She was the last person likely to be in the house, and yet he felt reluctant to go and look and have the clear proof that it was someone else. He stood leaning on a plank he had taken hold of, listening to sounds which his imagination interpreted for him so pleasantly that the keen strong face became suffused with the timid tenderness. The light footstep moved about the kitchen, followed by the sound of the sweeping brush, hardly making so much noise as the lightest breeze that chases the autumn leaves along the dusty path, and Adam's imagination saw a dimpled face, with dark bright eyes and roguish smiles looking backward at this brush, and a rounded figure just leaning a little to clasp the handle. A very foolish thought. It could not be Hetty, but the only way of dismissing such nonsense from his head was to go and see who it was, for his fancy only got nearer and nearer to belief while he stood there listening. He loosened the plank and went to the kitchen door. "How do you do, Adam Bede?" said Dinah, in her calm treble, pausing from her sweeping and fixing her mild grave eyes upon him. "I trust you feel rested and strengthened again to bear the burden and heat of the day." It was like dreaming of the sunshine and awaking in the moonlight. Adam had seen Dinah several times, but always at the Hall Farm, where he was not very vividly conscious of any woman's presence except Hetty's, and he had only in the last day or two begun to suspect that Seth was in love with her, so that his attention had not hitherto been drawn towards her for his brother's sake. But now her slim figure, her plain black gown, and her pale serene face impressed him with all the force that belongs to a reality contrasted with a preoccupying fancy. For the first moment or two he made no answer, but looked at her with the concentrated, examining glance which a man gives to an object in which he has suddenly begun to be interested. Dinah, for the first time in her life, felt a painful self-consciousness. There was something in the dark, penetrating glance of this strong man so different from the mildness and timidity of his brother Seth. A faint blush came, which deepened as she wondered at it. This blush recalled Adam from his forgetfulness. "I was quite taken by surprise. It was very good of you to come and see my mother in her trouble," he said, in a gentle, grateful tone, for his quick mind told him at once how she came to be there. "I hope my mother was thankful to have you," he added, wondering rather anxiously what had been Dinah's reception. "Yes," said Dinah, resuming her work. "She seemed greatly comforted after a while, and she's had a good deal of rest in the night, by times. She was fast asleep when I left her." "Who was it took the news to the Hall Farm?" said Adam, his thoughts reverting to someone there. He wondered whether she had felt anything about it. "It was Mr. Irwine, the clergyman, told me, and my aunt was grieved for your mother when she heard it, and wanted me to come, and so is my uncle. I'm sure, now he's heard it, that he was gone out to Rosseter all yesterday. They'll look for you there as soon as you've got time to go, for there's nobody round that half but what's glad to see you." Dinah, with her sympathetic divination, knew quite well that Adam was longing to hear if Hetty had said anything about their trouble. She was too rigorously truthful for benevolent invention, but she had contrived to say something in which Hetty was tacitly included. Love has a way of cheating itself consciously, like a child who plays at solitary hide and seek. It is pleased with assurances that it all the while disbelieves. Adam liked what Dinah had said so much that his mind was directly full of the next visit he should pay to the Hall Farm, when Hetty would perhaps behave more kindly to him than she had ever done before. "But you won't be there yourself any longer?" he said to Dinah. "No, I go back to Snowfield on Saturday, and I shall have to set out to Treddleston early." to be in time for Oakbourne carrier, so I must go back to the farm tonight, that I may have the last day with my aunt and her children. But I can stay here all to-day, if your mother would like me, and her heart seemed inclined towards me last night." "Ah, then, she's sure to want you to-day. If mother takes to people at the beginning, she's sure to get fond of 'em. But she's a strange way of not liking young women. Though, to be sure," Adam went on, smiling, "her not liking other young women is no reason why she shouldn't like you." Hitherto Gyp had been assisting at this conversation in motionless silence, seated on his haunches, and alternately looking up in his master's face to watch its expression, and observing Dinah's movements about the kitchen. The kind smile with which Adam uttered the last words was apparently decisive with Gyp of the light in which the stranger was to be regarded, and as she turned round after putting aside her sweeping brush, he trotted towards her and put up his muzzle against her hand in a friendly way. "You see Gyp bids you welcome," said Adam, "and he's very slow to welcome strangers." "Poor dog," said Dinah, patting the rough grey coat. "I've a strange feeling about the dumb things as if they wanted to speak, and it was a trouble to 'em because they couldn't. I can't help being sorry for the dogs always, though perhaps there's no need. But they may well have more in them than they know how to make us understand, for we can't say half what we feel, with all our words." Seth came down now, and was pleased to find Adam talking with Dinah. He wanted Adam to know how much better she was than all other women. But after a few words of greeting, Adam drew him into the workshop to consult about the coffin, and Dinah went on with her cleaning. By 6 o'clock they were all at breakfast, with Lisbeth in a kitchen as clean as she could have made it herself. The window and door were open, and the morning air brought with it a mingled scent of southern wood, thyme, and sweet briar from the patch of garden by the side of the cottage. Dinah did not sit down at first, but moved about, serving the others with the warm porridge and the toasted oatcake, which she had got ready in the usual way, for she had asked Seth to tell her just what his mother gave them for breakfast. Lisbeth had been unusually silent since she came downstairs, apparently requiring some time to adjust her ideas to a state of things in which she came down like a lady to find all the work done, and sat still to be waited on. Her new sensation seemed to exclude the remembrance of her grief. At last, after tasting the porridge, she broke silence. "Ye might ha' made the porridge worse," she said to Dinah. "I can ate it without its turning my stomach. It might ha' been a trifle thicker, and no harm, and I always puttin' a sprig o' mint in myself. But how's you to know that? The lads arena like to get folks as 'ull make their porridge, as I've made it for 'em. It's well if they get on body as 'ull make porridge at all. But ye might do with a bit o' showin', for ye're a stirrin' body in a morning, and ye've a light heel, and ye've cleaned the house well enough for a Mayshift." "Makeshift, mother," said Adam. "Why, I think the house looks beautiful. I don't know how it could look better." "Thee dostna know. Nay, how's thee to know? The men ne'er know whether the floor's clean or cat licked. But thee'll know when thee gets thy porridge burnt, as it's like enough to be when I'm gin, or makin' it. Thee think thy mother war good for something then?" Dinah said, "Seth, do come and sit down now and have your breakfast. We're all served now." "Aye, come and sit ye down, do," said Lisbeth, "and ate a morsel. Ye'd need, arter being up on your legs this hour and a half already. Come then," she added, in a tone of complaining affection, as Dinah sat down by her side. "I'll be loath for you go, but you canna stay much longer, I doubt. I could put up with you in the house better nor with most folks." "I'll stay till to-night if you're willing," said Dinah. "I'd stay longer, only I'm going back to Snowfield on Saturday, and I must be with my aunt to-morrow." "Ah, I'd ne'er go back to that country. My old man come from that Stonyshire side, but he left it when he were a young un, and I the right on too, for he said as there wor no wood there, and it ought ha' been a bad country for a carpenter." "Ay," said Adam, "I remember father telling me when I was a little lad that he made up his mind if ever he moved it should be south'ard. But I'm not so sure about it. Bartle Massey says, and he knows the south, as the northern men are a finer breed than the southern, harder headed and stronger bodied, and a deal taller. And then he says in some of those counties it's as flat as the back o' your hand, and you can see nothing of a distance without climbing up the highest trees. I couldn't abide that. I like to go to work by a road that'll take me up a bit of a hill, and see the fields for miles round me, and a bridge, or a town, or a bit of steeple here and there. It makes you feel the world's a big place, and there's no other men working in it with their heads and hands besides yourself." "I like the hills best," said Seth, "when the clouds are over your head, and you see the sun shining ever so far off, over the Loamford way, as I've often done o' late, on the stormy days. It seems to me as if that was heaven, where there's always joy and sunshine, though this life's dark and cloudy." "Oh, I love the Stonyshire side," said Dinah. "I shouldn't like to set my face towards the countries where they're rich in corn and cattle, and the ground so level and easy to tread, and to turn my back on the hills where the poor people have to live such a hard life, and the men spend their days in the mines away from the sunlight. It's very blessed on a bleak cold day, when the sky is hanging dark over the hill, to feel the love of God in one's soul, and carry it to the lonely, bare, stone houses where there's nothing else to give comfort." "Eh," said Lisbeth, "that's very well for ye to talk, as looks welly like the snowdrop flowers. Has ye lived for days and days when I'n given 'em with nothing but a drop o' water and peep o' daylight? But the hungry folks had better leave the hungry country. It makes less mouths for the scant cake." But she went on, looking at Adam. "Donna thee talk o' going south'en or north'en, and leaving thy father and mother i' the churchyard, and going to a country as they know nothing on? I'll ne'er rest i' my grave if I donna see thee i' the churchyard of a Sunday." "Donna fear, mother," said Adam. "If I hadn't made up my mind not to go, I should ha' been gone before now." He had finished his breakfast now, and rose as he was speaking. "What art going to do?" asked Lisbeth. "Set about thy father's coffin?" "No, mother," said Adam. "We're going to take the wood to the village and have it made there." "Na, my lad, nay!" Lisbeth burst out in an eager, wailing tone. "Thee won't not let nobody make thy father's coffin but thysen? Who'd make it so well, and him as knowed what good work wor, and got a son as is the head of the village, and all treadles on too for cleverness?" "Very well, mother, if that's thy wish, I'll make the coffin at home. But I thought thee wouldstna like to hear the work going on." "And why shouldn't I like it? It's the right thing to be done. And what's liking got to do wi't? It's choice o' mislikings is all in got i' this world. One morsel's as good as another when your mouth's out o' taste. Thee mun, Set about it now this morning, first thing. I won't have nobody to touch the coffin but thee." Adam's eyes met Seth's, which looked from Dinah to him rather wistfully. "No, mother," he said, "I'll not consent but Seth shall have a hand in it too, if it's to be done at home. I'll go to the village this forenoon, because Mr. Burge'll want to see me, and Seth shall stay at home and begin the coffin. I can come back at noon, and then he can go." "Nay, nay," persisted Lisbeth, beginning to cry. "In set my heart on as thee shalt mar thy father's coffin. Thee so stiff and masterful. Thee ne'er do as thy mother wants thee. Thee wast often angered with thy father when he were alive. Thee must be the better to him now he's gone. He'd ha' thought nothing on't for Seth to mar's coffin." "Say no more, Adam, say no more," said Seth, gently, though his voice told that he spoke with some effort. "Mother's in the right. I'll go to work, and do thee stay at home." He passed into the workshop immediately, followed by Adam, while Lisbeth, automatically obeying her old habits, began to put away the breakfast things, as if she did not mean Dinah to take her place any longer. Dinah said nothing, but presently used the opportunity of quietly joining the brothers in the workshop. They had already got on their aprons and paper caps, and Adam was standing with his left hand on Seth's shoulder, while he pointed with the hammer in his right to some boards which they were looking at. Their backs were turned towards the door by which Dinah entered, and she came in so gently that they were not aware of her presence till they heard her voice saying, "Seth Bede." Seth started, and they both turned around. Dinah looked as if she did not see Adam, and fixed her eyes on Seth's face, saying with calm kindness, "I won't say farewell. I shall see you again when you come from work, so as I'm at the farm before dark, it will be quite soon enough." "Thank you, Dinah. I should like to walk home with you once more. It'll perhaps be the last time." There was a little tremor in Seth's voice. Dinah put out her hand and said, "You'll have sweet peace in your mind to-day, Seth, for your tenderness and long suffering towards your aged mother." She turned round and left the workshop as quickly and quietly as she had entered it. Adam had been observing her closely all the while, but she had not looked at him. As soon as she was gone, he said, "I don't wonder at thee for loving her, Seth. She's got a face like a lily." Seth's soul rushed to his eyes and lips. He had never yet confessed his secret to Adam, but now he felt a delicious sense of disburdenment as he answered, "Ay, Addy, I do love her too much, I doubt. But she doesn't love me, lad, only as one child of God loves another. She'll never love any man as a husband, that's my belief." "Nay, lad, there's no telling. Thee mustn't lose heart. She's made out o' stuff with a finer grain than most o' the women. I can see that clear enough. But if she's better than they are in other things, I canna think she'll fall short of 'em in lovin'." No more was said. Seth set out to the village, and Adam began his work on the coffin. "God help the lad, and me too," he thought, as he lifted the board. "We're like enough to find life a tough job, hard work inside and out. It's a strange thing to think of a man as can lift a chair with his teeth, and walk 50 mile on end, trembling and turning hot and cold, at only a look from one woman out of all the rest o' the world. It's a mystery we can give no account of, but no more we can of the sprouting o' the seed, for that matter." Chapter 11.